Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And as always, at the end of the month, the last episode of every month, we have Emily Jashinsky. She's a senior fellow with us at IWF, but she is also the culture editor over at The Federalist. She helps train up young journalists on the right at Young America's Foundation, and she has a show every Friday with Ryan Grimm over at Breaking Points, the spinoff from the Crystal and Sagar show, Breaking Points. What's it? I always forget what it's called. Counterpoints.
Yeah, we went with counterpoints.
Yeah. So the Crystal and Sagar's is Breaking Points, and yours is Counterpoints. But they do a great show every Friday, even though it means that Emily is proximate to communism and comes back with all these wild Marxist ideas.
Yeah, I support a minimum wage.
It's interesting. Like, actually, I want to start out with this. Now that you've mentioned the minimum wage, I had the opportunity, interesting opportunity to give a talk at Yale's Buckley Club, and it was on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. And so I was rereading Capitalism and Freedom, which I haven't read for, I don't know, a decade. I read it in college, right? And I just remember being really influenced by it in college. And when I was going back and rereading it, it was just wrong. Like the things that it described as impossible are things that we live with every day now. So it was just very remarkable experience. So I'll just give you a couple quick examples. He writes that the publisher cannot afford to publish books with which he personally agrees, or only publish books with which he personally agrees, right? That's what's happening, right, with publishers and distribution outlets like Amazon. It's just there were a few, like another one was about the BBC not allowing Churchill to give a warning pretty early on about Hitler because his views were considered extreme, and because it's a state-run institution, he basically was denied access to the public's ear. Well, that's happening on YouTube and Twitter and that whole shebang. So anyway, your comment about the minimum wage just reminded me, because there's still a lot of really great stuff in that book, but there's just like these discordant notes in the theory that I once believed about the free market. Because it's just, if you open your eyes to what's going on around us, it seems like Milton Friedman didn't really predict the kind of corporate collusion that we have going on right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I thought you were going to say the opposite. I thought you were going to say when you revisited the book, you were struck by how interesting and sort of prescient some of it was, and I'm sure some of it still is, because I find that when I go and read, like a Murray Rothbard or something, like the real anti-statists, they tap into that. But what you just described from Friedman is so interesting, because it's this total, I think, lack of prescience when it comes to where the cultural institutions were going. If you combine it with God and Man at Yale, and you combine sort of monopolization in the tech industry with God and Man at Yale, that's just those two particular points are very interesting.
Yeah, it's God and Man at Yale turned out to be a lot more important than prescient freedom. I think I've just cut out. But I thought God and Man at Yale ended up being quite prescient in a way that Milton Friedman sadly did not. He still had a lot of really great proposals, but what struck me was kind of a contempt for the political, right? More broadly speaking. And he explicitly says, basically democracy and the political process more generally is a sort of least bad option, right? It's better always to allow the complete freedom of choice that the market allows. So like every individual can choose between a smorgasbord of options, right? And then for those things that really doesn't work for, because there are specific conditions, right, in that particular area of life, then we submit ourselves reluctantly to this political process, right, which is the least bad of the political processes, right? And it really was, it was interesting. It was interesting to reread it, because I think that would have rang very true with me 10, 15 years ago. And now I am like a unapologetic enthusiast of the political process, because it seems to me that the problem is that that sphere has shrunk so much, and we've handed over basically, like, that vacuum wasn't filled by this individualistic free market that Milton Friedman imagined. It was filled by technocracy, bureaucracy, like, forms of power, whether public or private, and sometimes both.
But that has to also have been incorrect at the time. The notion that there are no publishers, or you could even replicate that in other industries that can't afford to publish things they disagree with. I mean, I assume sort of if he's talking only about major publishers, that makes more sense. But there had to have been, for instance, like small Catholic publishing shops. There had to have been small Jewish publishing shops that would not be publishing the Catholic stuff and vice versa. So even at the time, unless he was just talking about like the major people, the major players, that can't have even been true.
I think he was saying something a little more reasonable, which is that the entire market of publishing can't afford to, like, exclude a large part of their customers, right? So, I don't think he would disagree that any particular publisher
I
can do that,
see.
but the
Okay.
point he was making was more, um, just that you'll find a publisher because somebody wants to make money. If some people wanna read something, somebody wants to make money on it, right? Um, and what it doesn't account for is that if you have even in outside of a monopoly context, right? Because the only context that he could acknowledge this kind of, situation happening was in a monopoly context, but you don't need a monopoly if you all agree with each other, right? If let's say 80% of the publishing market space is taken by companies who compete with each other, but still hold the same cultural views and still find the same books repugnant, right?
Yeah.
You can end up just excluding part of the market because you can just count on your competitors to do the same. And I think
Mhm.
he would have imagined that there would be like this gutsy little pop-up publisher or whatever, but we've seen that that doesn't actually, happen as smoothly. That kind of like competitive entrance to the market to try to serve sort of ideologically excluded customers. We haven't really seen that market mechanism work very well. I don't
And
know,
I'm
maybe
wondering,
it has worked a
I'm
little better, but
I'm wondering at the time what it was like for like virulent communists in America, or virulent pro-gay writers in America on the publishing side. I don't know, but I'm wondering if that was also just like a blind spot at the time, or that it was the Overton window was such that he was talking about sort of things that were considered within the reasonable viewpoint, and now we've pushed mainstream things out of the reasonable kind of Overton window space, and like it's you've seen that shift happen.
yeah, I mean, he explicitly defends the right of communists to participate in the market and so on, and like like spread their ideas through the market, and so he's very explicit about not being a hypocrite, actually, and like saying like
But
yes, even communists need to have their sort of fair shake at the market. So I think he
I guess I'm just wondering if they did, if the market worked in the way that he envisioned at the time.
I mean, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I mean, you do have obviously the Red Scare and then the McCarthy era, which McCarthy was more correct than most people want to admit, even if you disagree with how he dealt with it. I mean, the fact that there were a lot of communists in U.S. government,
I'm
uh,
reading the Stan Evans book right now, actually.
it's the Verona Papers, everything is. But yeah, there were a lot of communists. It's interesting. The golden age of American communism is clearly like the 30s and 40s, and then in the once it sort of becomes clear that there's going to be a Cold War between the USSR and the United States. They really because it's hard to imagine. I mean, I guess not fully today because they have reinserted themselves in the political discourse, but like in the 30s and 40s, it's very common for very like prominent people to be members of the Communist Party.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's I was just thinking about this actually because it reminds me in some ways of Trump, and when Trump comes along, because everybody else has lost all of their trust. Trump says something, and then the people who rightfully have no trust in anything left will believe Donald Trump and his sort of version of current affairs or history or whatever. It's the same thing though with people who like Oliver Stone will say something bad about Churchill, and because everybody else has, maybe given a less than balanced view of Churchill or someone forever, it's automatically like, well, Oliver Stone must be right. Like he's the one that's jumping in. So what some folks on the right are experiencing is what has plagued the left for decades, and that like Howard Zinn comes along, and because he tells a different version of a story that has been told without some balance in certain cases, they're like, well, Howard Zinn's version of history is 100% accurate.
I mean, he was Zinn was very explicit that he wasn't even really writing history, but like, um, I do want to. This was not the tangent I was planning on going on, but
A
but
good
it is
one
interesting
nonetheless.
that it just that form of libertarianism just doesn't seem to describe the world that we live in very well. Which is not to say that there are no sort of good libertarian impulses or that all libertarian ideas are bad. Actually, that that book, Capitalism and Freedom, is literally um, full of examples of really good policies that are still really important and necessary. So the most obvious one being school choice. Um, so it's like there's these very good. If there's something that's good about libertarians, I think they often find like wonky, good policy solutions to very specific problems, but their sort of overall analysis of life, politics, the sort of the art of human beings living together in a political community just seems very obviously wrong today in a way that it wasn't obviously wrong. Maybe I was just younger and dumber. I don't know. But like I also think the world just hadn't shown certain trends or tendencies yet that would totally and obviously disprove some of the things that sound really good on paper and about libertarianism.
Yeah, it makes more sense to reflexively err on the side of free markets when and individuals when you have more of a public consensus. But it gets harder to protect everybody's rights, et cetera, and to do that when you don't have that consensus.
So speaking of consensus, this is a very smooth operation I'm running here. Speaking of consensus, it is lacking in the Republican Party right now, which is fighting a type of civil war over this omnibus bill. Um, so the omnibus bill passed the Senate. We're talking on Friday before Christmas. It did pass the Senate. I think it's going to be voted on in the House. You probably know better than I do. But it passed the Senate by a big margin. I think it was like 68, and then there were several other Republican senators who didn't show up. And there are a lot of kind of unusual names of people on this list too. Like Tom Cotton voted for it. Ben Sass didn't show up. I guess that's not surprising. Um, but so and then there's this rebellion right in the House. There's this talk of a rebellion and how the House members, because they're angry about the fact that this omnibus bill is killing one of their major tools in their toolbox for this incoming House majority, um, that they might kill Republican senators' earmarks specifically. So there might be this kind of civil war thing. What is the situation with that, first of all, and then what do you think is how it's going to turn out? And what does it say about the state of the Republican Party?
It's definitely omnibus theater, which the Republican Party is used to, and it is reminiscent of a lot of the Tea Party era fights. And I think it's good. It's fundamentally a good thing to say we're drawing a line. And they're not entirely naive. It's kind of the same thing with what's happening in the speaker battle right now, where you have Andy Biggs mounting a challenge to Kevin McCarthy that is a long shot at best, but also sort of designed to threaten McCarthy with not getting the votes that he would need. It's possible if this really played out, you end up with like a Speaker Hakeem Jeffries of a GOP majority. That's not going to happen though, because nobody's naive. There's an aspect of theater to all of this. And what Mike Lee has been doing is putting up amendments like the Title 42 one to push Democrats. It's sort of like poison pills that shouldn't be poison pills, to push Democrats, to push sort of centrist Republicans, and to see what their breaking points are. Because what's really happening here is they're saying on the House side, Republicans are saying, and on the Senate side, Republicans who are siding with the House Republicans are saying, we don't have to pass this year-long massive budget. We can pass a CR, a continuing resolution, and kick the can for a month until we have control of the House of Representatives and can knock out some of these leftist priorities. There are analyses of the omnibus bill that show a lot of money being funneled to pet causes of the left, and that would include, I think, some really noxious organizations that are pushing woke agendas, if we use that word.
Yeah. So what does this say about? Because nobody wants this. Like I mean, Americans don't want the government to shut down, I suppose. But if you read a list of what's in this bill, no, this is not like popular, right? This is not like nobody's even bothering to make an argument for how this bill is good. They're just Have you noticed that? Nobody is like saying, I mean, McConnell's saying, oh, it's the best we're going to get or whatever, but nobody's actually like, oh, there's some really great things in this. Like, it's very obviously a huge pork stuffed bill with a bunch of projects and everybody got their little thing, but the American people obviously don't like nobody first of all there's thousands of pet projects in this bill, but I haven't heard anyone actually defend and say this is a great bill and it does X, Y, and Z for the American people. This is like become our sort of hollowed out decline era tradition where we just roll everything and desperately try to fund the government at the last minute, and it's an entirely horse trading behind the scenes exercise in which there really is no small d democratic input.
Yeah, and all of these dumb priorities get their pork through it, and we perpetuate these questionable groups because Republicans aren't pushing back hard enough because they'd rather get home for Christmas and avoid the PR nightmare of a Christmas time government shutdown. So yeah, I mean it's like extremely frustrating, and it's we'd have to ask Rachel Beauford what the mechanism is to change the sort of. I know I've seen it floated by people like Rachel and others. I couldn't describe it specifically, but it's depressing to think that in the Trump era, we didn't get to a place where we would also be avoiding omnibuses because honestly, people love omnibuses. Like Congress loves omnibuses. They love it. It's where they can get they can sneak in the interesting spending that they can go home and say, we renamed the Lake Champlain Basin for Patrick Leahy, which is part of this bill. We can do X, Y, and Z. And so they like it. They can placate special interests while funding the government, and it's a way to just sort of have their cake and eat it too. But it is truly, like you said, Inez, it feels like a symptom of decay that we can't get out of this vicious cycle.
Yeah, because I mean, it's the same thing with raising the debt ceiling, right? Like there are these things that have to happen. They're the most basic functions of government and the most basic functions of Congress. Like it almost seems like Congress does almost nothing other than these bills, and these bills don't actually address any of the priorities that either side, for the most part, is actually running on. Like, the Democrats in the midterms did not run on renaming Lake Champlain for Patrick Leahy, right? Like, it's not. It's entirely this horse trading exercise, and I'm not wholly against the horse trading. Like, I understand that this is kind of this is how the sausage gets made and how
the lubricant, yeah.
passed. I do think the alternative with no earmarks, like I was a huge member of the Tea Party, but I was very much against their anti-earmark stance because the alternative is they just write these vague funding provisions to the administrative state, and then the administrative state does the earmarks, right? So like instead of this Democrat who wants to rename something for Patrick Leahy, it's like some bureaucrat who's like, I really like this park and I'd like to name it for my friend, which in my view is even worse, right? So I'm not entirely against the earmarks, but it does seem, as you said, like it seems like a really obvious symptom of just failure of institutions, and decay of institutions, that this is literally all that Congress does because it has to,
Yeah.
right? It's
no, I think that's a good point. Well, yeah, it's a good point because if you look at what's been considered in the omnibus, like we've just been seeing random things get jammed into the omnibus per usual. There are bills about press freedom. There's bills about the border. There's so many. There's bills about opening up the app marketplace and the big tech front. All of this getting jammed into an omnibus, and for an interesting reason, right? Which is it's sort of testing to see where everybody's red line really is, but also because they don't vote on this stuff anymore. They don't bring it to the floor on a sort of individual basis because it's so like that again, that kind of like lack of consensus, the lack of will to actually do this stuff. Border stuff in particular is such a great example. The Title 42 extension, why do we have to slap that in an omnibus? I understand the timing, but it's a great question of like, this stuff can all be litigated more directly through the democratic process, and it never is. Because, and I'm not talking about like California, your home state's referendum system, but I mean just like in the normal sort of function of Congress, republicanism, we should be able to litigate the border without having to kick it to an executive order or a provision that we attempt to slap into an omnibus to test Democrats. It's Congress. It's not the fault of Mike Lee. It's the fault of Congress more generally that it comes to this every year.
Yeah, it's like the normal order of things. Like the standard operating procedure now is flying by the seat of your pants everywhere, um, in a very like corrupt and anti-democratic way. And I think you're really right to bring up that Title Two or Title 42 um, as an example, right? Like we don't have a functioning immigration law and border protection law, right? We don't have a functioning border. And now we are reliant on the Supreme Court in the last few days, sweeping in a day before this emergency declaration, sort of emergency power under the pandemic expires, right? And essentially saving even the like semblance of law on the border, which is already a disaster because you had Democratic mayors declaring states of emergency all up and down the border, right? Because it was going to be an incredible flood of people. Because, by the way, there are Democratic NGOs who are probably funded via this
Yeah,
omnibus bill who are going down and telling people, oh, hey, Title 42 is expiring. Now's the time to cross the border, right? It's there's
that is a
something.
really good point. Like if there are like that is a really really good point. That it's sort of this could be completely counterproductive on the one hand if you have the provision to save Title 42 and at the same time you're funding the NGOs because there's no direction or purpose to an omnibus bill other than funding the government and in a million different directions that you're just going to be like undercutting yourself. And Title 42 is a good example of this in and of itself because it's already a bureaucratic stopgap measure, right?
Yeah.
It's already there. The only reason that Title 42, most Republicans agree the pandemic is over, but they want Title 42, right? It's already this bureaucratic stopgap measure because Democrats refuse to really seriously consider border legislation. And so we're already sort of kicking the can to the administrative state because there's no consensus to be had, period, on what securing the border would look like. And there's a total undermining of the rule of law on behalf of Democratic mayors around the country who drag these migrants, bait these migrants to coming to the country by saying they'll be safe in sanctuary cities. So it means that you can come to the country, cross the border, disappear into the shadows, never show up for an asylum hearing, or just hope that laws get changed while you wait it out, which absolutely happens. And that's just the way it goes. And it's already exactly what you're talking about, the lack of ability to govern.
Yeah, there's this weird dynamic now, and I guess you could call it a late stage empire dynamic or something, if you want it to be depressing before Christmas.
You're wearing a skull
There
sweater.
I thought it was cute. Uh, but,
Funny.
it's kind of like a Wednesday Addams take on the Fair Isle sweater,
Yes.
for those not watching on YouTube. No, but there's this weird, dichotomy that is like it really rankles me where there's like this incredible amount of direct consequence and accountability for totally stupid irrelevant things like a tweet from 5 years ago from someone who made a joke one time, right? Or like, you know, there were a couple examples in the last few months, of students who had their college acceptance rescinded because, like, there was a video of them singing along to a rap song and, like, and dropping the N word, like, therefore, they should be their whole lives should be ruined, and they should be, um, those kinds of things. There's, like, this incredible, very specific accountability, immediate accountability. In fact, I think the left, instead of calling it cancel culture, right, they call it accountability culture, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, people who actually have enormous amounts of power, who are making decisions every day that affect millions of people's lives in very significant ways, up to and including war, there's no accountability whatsoever. You have that perfect Thomas Sowell. That's a guy who held up, by the way.
Yeah.
But like, they got that perfect Thomas Sowell sort of situation where people who are making incredibly important decisions suffer no consequences if they did make those decisions wrong. Like, we lost a war and people got promoted. Nobody got fired. You know, like there's no accountability for people who are actually making incredibly important decisions, and there's like this very intense accountability for everybody else who like made a joke 3 years ago. And it's incredibly frustrating, and there just seemed to be some kind of power class dynamic, angle to this, because it's disgusting. It really makes me angry. You can tell I'm getting worked up, but like it really makes me angry that people can make such important decisions. I guess this boils down to this the Spider-Man thing, right? With great power ought to come great responsibility. And instead, what we've done is with great power comes absolutely no responsibility. But if you're just a random dude, then you have all the responsibility in the world.
It's I think what you just described is accurately is a really simple formulation. It's oligarchy. And I remember when Bernie Sanders said something about how we were living in an oligarchy back in, I don't know, like 2018 something. And I think I got like hot and bothered about it. I think I was like annoyed because that seemed hyperbolic to me. And it seemed like the sort of fear mongering that a lot of the left kind of fundraises off of and doesn't seriously mean. And I think maybe at the time, we were right on the precipice. So I would disagree even with what I wrote at the time, but I actually think it's shifted very clearly. There have been changes that have like pushed us, nudged us pretty squarely into oligarchy, categorically into an oligarchy. And exactly what you're just describing, I think, is exactly that, because it's not just government and it's not just private interests. It's both government and private interests that shield themselves while wielding their power against everybody sort of outside of that elite space of power. And that's basically what it feels like to me.
Yeah, it's like nobody has any responsibility because I mean there's a lot of like overlapping layers of this, and I think it's defensible that you would call it oligarchy. There's no, so you would think that via capitalism and freedom and Milton Friedman and all this stuff, there would be a market accountability for private actors. We've now
Right.
seen that mechanism has broken down through a combination of sort of cultural collusion between major companies. And something, frankly, we have to admit that the left had a point, that there is enormous concentration of market share, usually not in the monopoly, but usually something more like an oligopoly within a lot of these different fields. It really blunts the consumer response, and then there's the cultural collusion, which I think is the bigger problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this, I mean, thinking about the last Twitter files drop, right, where you've literally got it's so quintessential. Like, this story is now the American story of how one becomes powerful and rich, right? This guy, Yoel Roth, gets into the University of Pennsylvania and does his doctorate work on his own sex life, right? Like, his dissertation is about Grinder, and
Oh
and
yeah.
this is the qualification that launches him into an incredibly powerful and lucrative position where he's policing perhaps the most influential social media network, not by usership, but by influence on the national discourse and in media, right? And what's his qualification? What actual elite qualifications does he have? It's literally a dissertation about his sex life. That's why he's there. Um, and there's no accountability. And now he's emailing every day back and forth with the FBI, some guy who's probably also wrote his dissertation on his sex life, because that is the qualification now. It's like this very hollow ideological qualification uh, for a pipeline into the elite, an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of power, and it all feels fake. It all like this doesn't seem real. And the fact that we seem to continue and to be able to perpetuate, um, at least quasi normal day to day life in America, I think is just a function of how rich we are.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. I think this is Yoel Roth is a good case study in something that you talk about absolutely all the time, the breakdown in our system of credentialing. But it's also sort of like we broke down our system of credentialing because we questioned all legitimate standards, totally threw the baby out with the bathwater as we were in the sort of postmodern milieu, as we were trying to say, we need to correct for discrimination against women, minorities. We just threw everything out the window and said none of it matters because truth is relative. So if somebody writes and by the way, there's an incoherence in that message. If truth is relative, then we can't prize some truths simply because they're bad imitations of Foucault. We can't say doing a bad imitation of Foucault is better than writing your dissertation on the problems of the Reformation or something like that, simply because it's a bad imitation of Foucault. But that's where we've landed. You sort of if you throw truth out the window in the name of hedonism, that's really what it is, and that's what it's this faux. It's a faux moral relativism because it's not really relativistic. At the end of the day, it prizes the sort of hedonism above everything else. It will come up with a million different justifications for hedonism above everything else, and that's the best way to succeed, is to imitate the intellectualism that justifies any different hedonistic ends. And so it's just a bad imitation of substance is how you win out. And we see it how many times. Sam Brinkman, Yoel Roth, they're like Kamala Harris, good example. Like you could just, it just is like constant.
She's the vice president.
Yeah.
And the president can't string 3 words together.
Yeah.
And in Joe Biden's defense, I don't think I always thought like Joe Biden's reputation as being sort of an elder statesman or whatever was always overblown. Like even when he was being selected as Obama's VP, like I couldn't believe that they were describing this guy the way they were, as this kind of moderate elder statesman or whatever. But in his defense, like he's clearly declined in age. But Kamala Harris is unable to. I don't know. It just seems ridiculous to me that this person is the vice president, and it was equally ridiculous that Donald Trump became president of the United States. It should be like some kind of flashing, all of this stuff. I mean, is this our like sending a horse to the Senate moment?
Yes, it is.
It's
yes,
like,
and
we put Yoel Roth in charge of the digital public square because he wrote an essay about Grindr, and we're gonna have Kamala Harris as our vice president. And before that, we had Donald Trump. Like, is this all of this? Just we're sending a horse to the Senate? What is this?
It's exactly what it is. And it's because identity politics make us feel good in the absence of any sort of, any sort of moral grounding or foundation. We're, obviously just sort of flailing for things that make us feel good. And that's what identity politics is. And that's where you can sort of connect the dots between the hedonism I was talking about and Kamala Harris. It's not like Kamala Harris is talking about doing her PhD dissertation on Grindr, but she's this manifestation of how identity politics makes us feel better than substance, that it is mistaken for substance in and of itself. And that's how you elevate somebody like Kamala Harris, who couldn't even get to Iowa because voters weren't responding to her, to the vice presidency. And again, it just creates your society then becomes built on a house of cards, because it's not built on, like, it's not rooted in any sort of firm foundation. It's just a house of cards. There's nothing real. There's nothing substantive there other than the signaling. And the attempts to feel like you have purpose and meaning. And Kamala Harris and Yoel Roth, both like fantastic representations of that, because you just there it is. These two people who are way more style than substance, and by style I mean identity politics and all the rest, and it all crumbles when you're sort of pushed to do something serious. And you can actually bring that to the omnibus again. When we're pushed to do something serious, we're utterly incapable of doing anything meaningful and serious because we're built on the house of cards now.
Yeah, I know. I think that's really well put. That's the ultimately, it's not just identity politics and ideology and wokeism and all that. That's the problem. It's that it's pushing out real. I mean, I can't believe we didn't mention Sam Brinton yet, but like he's also obviously in this category. Like we
I
literally
did, but I
hired.
think I said Sam Brinkman. I don't know why I said that.
Well,
I think I was thinking
I always
Brinksmanship.
confuse SBF, like the names. I know
Yeah.
the two people, but SBF. That's the reason I'm calling him SBF instead of. But like Sam Brinkman Fried or
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
with
Brinton.
Sam Brinton, like they have
Yeah.
similar names, but anyway, they're two very good examples of this. It's 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 this bottom line assumption, and maybe this is just born from incredible wealth that this is inevitable, but it's this assumption that the way we live is like the baseline of the world, right? That like the enormous wealth and power in the United States is just how it is,
Mm.
and that will continue to perpetuate endlessly
Mm-hmm.
without adding to it, right? And it's this idea that you can have absolutely no competence or productivity, and I wonder how much of our economy is completely fake. Like how much
Yes.
of our GDP is just paying people to police other people's speech, or like you know keep the employees in line from making a joke about a bikini or something. And how much of our economy is completely fake? How
Or
much
is it
of our wealth
fake?
is completely fake?
Fake, speaking of Sam Bankman-Fried, how much of it is fake based on effective altruism, right? This postmodern attempt to feel something good, to feel as though you're contributing to the world, flailing and grasping for a sense of meaning that is actually rooted in nothing other than signaling. We now know that a decent chunk of our economy was built exactly on that, and I think it does raise the question, to your point, Inez. Or you can even go you can go even further, and you can talk about Lehman Brothers. You can talk about the stuff that it wasn't intended. The only sort of moral end was making more and more money, which is as empty as the moral end of racking up more and more virtue signal points. It's the exact same thing. It's just the other side of the coin. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge chunk of our economy. And I think one of the lost chapters of American history that's just not told very well is the Gilded Age. I think it's very interesting that HBO poured millions and millions of dollars into making a show on the Gilded Age that was very good last year, and I'm hoping it continues. But I think it's interesting that that came out now because, listen, like Carnegie had all of his reasons for turning to his version of effective altruism, but it was rooted in something much realer than what Sam Bankman-Fried's effective altruism was rooted in. And so, is this all part of the same time period? Is this all just the ice age of tech and whatever, or are these two distinct periods where the money that we've racked up in this era is fundamentally going to be used differently than it was before the turn of the 20th century? I
And
think
run
it's an
out.
open question.
Yeah, and run out because it's not being regenerated, right? That wealth, if it's being regenerated by a very small percentage of very productive people, especially in these tech companies, right? Like I think that's the real danger of Elon Musk. I actually have a essay coming out in the Washington Examiner magazine about this, but I really think that's the real danger that Elon Musk poses to the left. I think the censorship stuff is sort of what they throw out to their low IQ rabble on the left. I mean, has a low IQ rabble, but like I think they're like, oh yeah, Nazis are back on Twitter. Like here's
Yeah.
Kanye tweeting a swastika, like he's not clearly mentally ill. Those are the sort of I don't know. I think those are the kind of the smokescreen. And don't get me wrong, free speech in the new sort of public square that is Twitter and Facebook and all these social media companies, I think is an incredibly important issue. Um, but I think the real danger here is if Elon Musk can prove that he can run a tech company with a third of the staff, and it's just like a bunch of it's like 99% a bunch of like white and Asian guys and Pakistani guys like in a clearly stinky cubicle like coding all day. Um, if he can prove that you can cut your payroll by 70% and stick your finger in the eye of the diversicrats and turn there was some really good back of the envelope calculations done of basically just by cutting payroll how potentially profitable Elon Musk has made Twitter. Um, I don't know, man. We're going in like those tech companies the last 2 months, they've been laying off a lot of people. They're getting rid of they're kind of copying Elon Musk. They're getting rid of a lot of those perks. Meta just got rid of the $200 a month in like Lyft vouchers or whatever they were giving every employee. They got rid of some of that. There's going to be a belt tightening, and I think that's really what the sort of institutionalized left is afraid of, is that Elon Musk will show how many people making $150,000 or $300,000 in not just the tech sector, but in every facet of our economy are producing absolutely no value. And they're either doing email jobs or they're shifting like, one spreadsheet to another, but they're not actually producing any value. Or they're just the value they produce is purely ideological. They're political officers,
And that
well
they're
political officers.
in their control. I mean, I think it's also that if he shows that the folly of their sort of self-appointed police force mentality, that they, fundamentally, that we don't need to be controlled by them, and that in fact it's not good for shareholders to be parts of companies where they appoint themselves to exert that level of control and work with the FBI to control the American population and the American discourse, and that they don't have to, you can let speech exist because people are always going to think bad thoughts and always going to express bad thoughts. You can let it exist, and the truth sort of wins out, the light wins out ultimately in the end. It creates for a better world. If he shows that, man, there are a lot of jobs in trouble. There are a lot of, HR manuals that will have aged very poorly and probably get quietly revised.
And a lot of people who are going to lose their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, let's since this is our Christmas, this episode will air just after Christmas. Let's start with you mentioned Gilded Age, and I know you've written a review of White Lotus. I mean, what are you planning to watch over when you have maybe a little downtime over Christmas? What do you recommend? What have you enjoyed this year in terms of the cultural output of our declining civilization?
Oh my gosh, this is an impossible question because I basically watch everything. So for me to even like come up with, it's easier for people to like tell me examples and then I can say whether it's good or bad. I've been really enjoying the new season of Reno 911, which is the lowest of the lowbrow possible, but it has been fantastic. It's just like what was airing in the aughts on Comedy Central, unchanged, except for in the best possible way, which is that it is skewering the absurdities of sort of both Trump conservatism and woke leftism. And so it's just been fabulous. They've been absolutely fearless. They have a great cold open on pronouns that I hope the clip is online. I think I've seen it online, which everybody should go check out. But yeah, White Lotus, if people haven't checked out White Lotus, I can't possibly recommend it enough. I thought the second season built on the first season's momentum, and it's clearly a criticism, not a criticism, it's clearly a commentary on our decadent society, to borrow a phrase from Ross Douthat, which is a very brave thing to do on HBO, except it's very subtle to the point where I think it's tricked some people into enjoying this commentary on decadence. I think it's an open question whether it's a full critique, but it is at least a commentary. So that's a super, super bingeable show. As far as anything else, I'm trying to talk my way into remembering more of what I've watched this year off the top of my head because it's an overwhelming question. There's so much, but I'm not coming up with any answers while I try to run out the clock here.
No, but those are two good recommendations. I watched White Lotus. I finished the second season just like a week ago or something, a couple days ago. I don't know. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like beautifully done. It's very. I see what you're saying, that it's not clear it's a critique. At the same time it's shot. It's like making fun of it and making fun of how we are now. Um, but it's done in a way that is like makes it aesthetically sort of appealing in a certain way. And so yeah, I'm not clear on whether it's a critique or not. At least not a deep one. I think it's sort of a superficial critique for sure, but like I don't know what he was trying to say in like if he's really trying to like deeply criticize these people. But one of the things that I like about it is that without giving away too much is that like you see things go wrong, but then fundamentally, with a few notable exceptions, um, like things actually work out for the rich and powerful for the most part. Like it, especially in the first season, things work out for the rich and powerful, even though you think they will. Which I actually think is very true to life and very important to see because usually you don't see that on film anymore. I feel like.
Yeah, that's true in the first season. And that's why I think the first season is more of a class commentary and the second season is less of a class commentary and more of a gender commentary, because I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone. But I think there's a pretty, it's almost like it ends the class commentary in a very particular and definitive way itself. I don't know that that's true. I doubt it, because the whole premise is basically a following the rich and powerful on their vacations. And apparently they're going to the Maldives next, which is very, very exciting. But yeah, I saw it as like, one thing really I haven't seen a lot of conversation about is its treatment of LGBT culture. And again, like, is this a commentary on androgyny? Is it a commentary on sort of the life of extremely wealthy, powerful people without children? You know, whether it's Jennifer Coolidge or the sort of LGBT characters, I don't know, divorce, marriage, whatever it is, adultery, you get all of it. But I thought it was really fascinating this season how it took a Pollyan kind of lens to sex dynamics between men and women, and really, I think, honored women's. Yeah, I think the most important Polya piece of writing is the opening chapter of Sexual Persona on sex and nature. I think it's called Sex and Nature, or like women and men and violence, something like that. But this is like ripped straight out of the pages of that essay, which I think sets the tone for all of her work.
Yeah, I've long thought that the biggest difference between Polya and conservatives is basically that she's a conservative. I think she has an identical, at least to mine, like identical identical worldview on what the state of nature is and what the nature of sex is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a deeply conservative worldview, but I've always thought it's like almost like a personality difference. She's obviously like really excited by the state of nature in all of its like violence and sort of erotic passion. And I think there is something about conservatism that is easily parodied, of course, by the left, like well beyond any any reality. But there is something about like the instinctive conservative reaction that like, oh, this is really powerful, and we really need to be very careful with how we mess with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Polly just
Yeah.
seems like totally thrilled by the whole thing, by the state of nature. But I think, yeah, Emily and I did a whole episode on polio one time.
We should do
Well,
another
not
one.
on this podcast, but over at yeah, we should do another one. We should update on Polya. But I do think I think she's in that category of a handful of people whose views were sort of unusual, uh, and almost I can't really say this about Polly, but like James Burnham, Christopher Lash is having a revival, right? Like there's these thinkers that seem like wow, they really nailed something about where we're at right now. Whether it's they were writing in the 1940s or 1970s, right? They really kind of were prescient. Polya, I think, is the most prescient sort of chronicler of the sexual revolution, and where we are. So I would put her in that trio of thinkers that is just being proved more and more right every day.
Yeah, I think she also she's excited by the sexual revolution. She has a great line in that essay I was referring to, that everything great in the West has come from the quarrel with nature. And again, like I think you see that in White Lotus, even with like the LGBT characters, as I was talking about earlier, like what happens when you push all of this sort of into the mainstream, whether it's good or bad. I don't think we know what White Lotus is saying, but we know what it's saying is that there are going to be unforeseen challenges and difficulties. But uh, Palia, I think, where she, as the sort of, she refers to herself as like the baby boomer transgender. She's always referred to herself as transgender in a different kind of sense, in that she tests the limits and enjoys sort of pushing the limits of typical gender roles. But in that sense, I think she has also always been clear, and I think White Lotus is getting at something similar, that the quarrel with nature means there's a fight back, right? That human nature fights back with nature. It's part of nature for humans to also fight for limits, because Paulia talks about how the obscenity codes created the golden age of Hollywood, that the best films of all time are those that were operating within the strictest limits, because that's what makes the mystery of woman is what makes sex. It's what makes sex true to nature. It's what makes it beautiful. And if you're in a world absent any obscenity, what you get is the Kardashians posting pictures of their butts on Instagram every day. And Polly is very critical of that. So that's, I think, a huge point of divorce from her and a lot of the other sort of boomer philosophers. And that's like a very, very key distinction.
Yeah, I guess we'll wrap up on saying this. There seems to be no accountability and no limits, and instead of creating the flourishing of even sort of passion and art, right? We've found the opposite, right? Like one of the things that I've always comes back to me as one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life is in the context of UBI, but I think it applies to the conversation we're having now, is Nancy Pelosi arguing in favor of UBI on the basis that people will like write poetry all
That's
day
just
if they
Marx.
have UBI. And I think we're finding the opposite, that without limits, without accountability, without, real responsibility, we have not
Misery.
only, yeah, not only are we not happy, we're miserable. Not only do we have, quote unquote, no limits on who we are, now we don't know who we are. Um, and then we've, we're just sort of floating in the ether, and we don't even produce any, it might be like, or at least we, maybe we're having a revival now, but we don't seem to have in the last couple decades produced, notable art or beauty of any kind. We really haven't used our freedom from limitation
No, we're
in
the
a way that has
richest
been beautiful.
the richest, most privileged society to ever exist, and buy $10 lattes out of free shipping containers. Like, this is what we are building with our money, is we're dotting the suburbs with freaking shipping containers, Starbucks that are built to look like storage facilities that serve us $10 lattes. And it's just like insane, the juxtaposition with the wealth that you see with this total lack of real and true beauty, and that is, I think White Lotus is very much on that. And a super quick recommendation for people on a show that you may have missed because it's an Amy Schumer show. I highly recommend Life and Beth. That aired on Hulu earlier this year. It was in the spring, and it's very much in the vein of Girls. I think Girls is one of the best pieces of millennial art that will probably ever exist. It's self-aware, but not self-aware in the places that count. And I would describe Life and Beth as basically the exact same thing. This return to beauty and return to nature and return to truth, and it doesn't even know that's where it's going. So I just can't recommend that show enough. It's also funny. I know a lot of people hate Amy Schumer. She's had some really, really, the vast majority of her work since Trainwreck has been terrible, whereas before it, the vast majority of it was excellent. But this is actually it's funny and it's watchable, and I highly recommend it.
Well, that's good. Why don't we close out? I'm going to ask you what your plans are. You're at home, you're hanging out, which is why there's been a little drops in the internet and so on. But so what are you doing for Christmas? What are your Christmas traditions?
Yes, I'm in Wisconsin. It's 11 degrees below zero. The wind is blowing some 40, 50 mile per hour wind gusts outside. So I think the internet may not be as reliable as usual. But yeah, we'll just be celebrating Christmas with the cold and the snow, which is the best kind of Christmas possible. That makes you grateful for all of the enormous blessings that we have in today's day and age, and keeps everybody indoors together and nice and cozy. So we'll be going to church, opening presents. My mom is wants me to make cookies with her today, so I guess I'll be doing that.
That sounds wonderful. On my end, I mean, my husband is Christian, so I'm sort of like rookie Christmas, because I didn't celebrate Christmas most of my life, and but we always went back to his family. But for the last couple of years, it's been complicated for by COVID and now by like extremely high prices. I don't know if anyone has checked the cross country uh, planes lately, and apparently half of them are not going to make it given this storm coming in. Um, but so I've had to do a little bit of rookie Christmas myself. But the real holiday of the season for me has always been New Year's. I know a lot of people hate New Year's. I think that's ridiculous. I think it's kind of like a secular Yom Kippur um, for people. I think it is really important to mark the passage of time and to take stock of the decisions you've made in your life. And I'm actually I'm actually a very unsuperstitious person. I'm not. I have a hard time not laughing when people talk about astrology, for example. Um,
Oh,
but
ooh.
I am superstitious that the company and the feeling and I guess the vibes that you have for New Year's, I think it does set some kind of tone for the year. So it's always very important to me, to have good company, good cheer, and bring in the new year. So that's really my tradition here. But Emily, thank you for once again stopping by High Noon. And I hope that you and your family have a very Merry Christmas, cuddled in your warm home away from the minus 11 degrees, 50-mile-an-hour wind chill weather
Sa-
of Wisconsin.
Same to you folks up in New York. It's not warm there either.
No, it is not. All right. Thanks for coming on, Emily.
Thanks, it is.
Um, and you can also, thanks to our listeners, I always read this at the end. Thanks to our listeners, this is an IWF production. High Noon is an IWF production. We also have other productions. We have podcast She Thinks and At the Bar, the latter being a legal podcast and the former being more day-to-day politics. So you should check those out. And if you have if you hate Emily's recommendations, shows that you can watch over Christmas, or you just want to chime in on some of the things we've been talking about here, you can email me at inez.stepman@iwf.org. And as always, be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.